I'll never forget the sound of my cousin Brandon's laughter echoing through that mahogany-paneled law office when the attorney announced I was receiving absolutely nothing from Great-Aunt Margaret's will. The entire Sterling family erupted in cruel amusement, with my cousin Sophia actually pulling out her phone to record what she called the poor relation getting reality checked. But their laughter died instantly when lawyer William Carter cleared his throat and said the words that changed everything. However, there is the matter of the Margaret Sterling Educational Trust, valued at $50 million, which goes entirely to Jessica Thompson. The color drained from every face in that room so fast you'd think someone had opened a drain. And suddenly the same people who'd been mocking me were staring like I'd just grown a second head. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Thompson, and for 26 years I've lived as the forgotten branch of the Sterling family tree. While my relatives built their empire in gleaming Manhattan towers and sprawling Connecticut estates, I've been teaching third graders in a crumbling elementary school in Queens, coming home each night to a studio apartment so small I can touch both walls when I stretch my arms wide. The closest I've come to luxury is the occasional splurge on name-brand cereal instead of the store brand, and even that requires careful budgeting from my $48,000 teaching salary. The Sterling family fortune started 3 generations ago when my great-great-grandfather bought his first apartment building in what would eventually become prime Manhattan real estate. By the time Great-Aunt Margaret took control of Sterling Properties, the company owned office buildings, shopping centers, and residential complexes across the tri-state area. Margaret herself was a legend in real estate circles, a sharp-eyed woman who could spot profitable investments decades before anyone else and who built her empire without ever marrying or having children of her own. My connection to all this wealth comes through my grandmother, Margaret's younger sister Eleanor, who committed what the Sterling family considered an unforgivable sin. She fell in love with a working-class man. My grandfather was a mechanic who ran his own garage, and when Eleanor chose love over money, the Sterling family essentially wrote her off. My father grew up knowing he had wealthy relatives but never feeling welcome in their world, a legacy of rejection he passed down to me through stories and the occasional awkward family gathering where we were treated like charity cases. The divide became even more pronounced after my parents died in a car accident 3 years ago. I was 23, fresh out of college with a teaching degree and drowning in student loan debt, when I lost the only 2 people who'd ever made me feel like I mattered. The Sterling family's response to this tragedy was telling. They sent a modest flower arrangement to the funeral, and Robert Sterling, Margaret's nephew and the presumed heir to everything, made a brief appearance at the service where he offered his condolences and a business card in case I needed anything. What I needed was family, support, and help navigating the overwhelming grief of losing both parents simultaneously. But what I got was the clear message that I was on my own. Robert Sterling embodies everything people imagine when they think of old money arrogance. At 55, he carries himself with the confidence of a man who's never doubted his place in the world, wearing custom-tailored suits that cost more than I make in 3 months, and speaking in the measured tones of someone accustomed to being listened to without question. He's been running Sterling Properties for 15 years, ever since Margaret stepped back from day-to-day operations, and he's expanded the company's reach while maintaining its reputation for ruthless efficiency. His wife Patricia perfectly complements his image as the ideal society wife, blonde and elegant, and deeply involved in the charity circuit, though her philanthropy seems more about maintaining social status than actually helping people. Their children, Brandon and Sophia, represent the worst aspects of inherited privilege. Brandon graduated from Wharton with an MBA he barely earned, coasting through school on his family name and generous donations to the university, and now works at Sterling Properties in a vaguely defined executive role that seems to involve mostly long lunches and networking events. He's 28 but acts like he's still in college, driving a different luxury car every few months, and treating the family business like his personal piggy bank. Sophia, just a year younger than me, has built a career as a lifestyle influencer, documenting her expensive shopping trips and exotic vacations for hundreds of thousands of followers who seem fascinated by her display of effortless wealth. The rest of the Sterling clan follows similar patterns of entitlement and excess. David Sterling, Robert's younger brother, works as an investment banker and lives in a Hamptons estate with his wife Jennifer and their twin sons Michael and Matthew, both of whom are finishing college and expecting to slide into comfortable positions within the family empire. Helen Sterling Morrison, Margaret's other niece, married a prominent surgeon and raised their daughter Caroline to be a successful lawyer, though Caroline's legal career has been significantly helped by family connections and Sterling Properties' extensive need for legal services. What all these relatives share is an absolute certainty that they deserve their wealth and status, and an equally firm belief that I represent everything they've worked to distance themselves from. To them, I'm a reminder of what happens when Sterling blood mixes with ordinary people, a cautionary tale about the importance of marrying within your social class. They tolerate my existence but make it clear through countless small cruelties that I'll never truly belong in their world. The pattern of exclusion started early and continued throughout my life with methodical consistency. As a child, I'd hear about elaborate family vacations to European capitals and exclusive resorts, trips that somehow never had room for my family despite the Sterling's vast resources. Birthday parties at country clubs and coming-of-age celebrations at expensive venues were family affairs that we learned about secondhand, usually through casual mentions long after the events had passed. When I graduated high school as valedictorian, earning a full scholarship to college, the family's response was polite acknowledgement rather than celebration, as if academic achievement was expected rather than remarkable. College brought a brief reprieve from family dynamics, since I was too busy studying and working part-time jobs to pay for expenses not covered by my scholarship. I threw myself into education courses and volunteer work, discovering a passion for teaching that felt like my true calling. During those 4 years, I rarely interacted with the Sterling family except for the occasional awkward holiday gathering where I sat at the far end of the table and listened to conversations about business deals and social events that might as well have been happening on another planet. The scholarship that paid for my education was one of several academic awards I received, though I never learned where the funding actually came from. The paperwork listed it as the Educational Excellence Scholarship from an anonymous donor, and I assumed it was from some wealthy philanthropist who believed in supporting first-generation college students. I wrote thank you letters that were forwarded through the scholarship office, expressing my gratitude to whoever had made my education possible, but I never received any response or learned the identity of my mysterious benefactor. After graduation, I moved to Queens and started teaching at Riverside Elementary, a school that serves mostly working-class families, and operates on a shoestring budget that requires teachers to spend their own money on basic classroom supplies. The building is old and shows its age in peeling paint and outdated technology, but the students are eager to learn and their enthusiasm makes up for everything the school lacks in resources. I teach 3rd grade, which means spending my days with 8-year-olds who still believe their teacher knows everything, and who haven't yet learned to be cynical about education or their future prospects. My daily routine reflects the vast difference between my life and my Sterling relatives' existence. I wake up at 6 in my studio apartment, where my bed doubles as my couch and my kitchen table serves as my desk for grading papers in the evening. The apartment is in a decent neighborhood, but the building is old, with thin walls that let me hear my neighbors' conversations, and radiators that clank all night during winter. I take the subway to work, a 40-minute commute that involves 2 transfers and crowds of fellow working people heading to jobs that pay the bills but don't build generational wealth. Teaching elementary school is both rewarding and exhausting, requiring endless patience and creativity to engage young minds, while working within the constraints of standardized testing and limited funding. I spend my own money on books for students who don't have any at home, bring snacks for kids who come to school hungry, and stay after hours to help struggling students catch up with their reading. The emotional investment is enormous and the financial rewards are minimal, but I genuinely love helping children discover their potential and watching them gain confidence in their ability. Weekends bring additional work as I try to supplement my teaching income with shifts at Sunset Diner, a 24-hour restaurant near my apartment where I wait tables and serve coffee to late-night customers. The extra money helps pay down my student loans and covers unexpected expenses like car repairs or medical bills, but it also means I'm working 7 days a week with little time for rest or social activity. My colleagues at school sometimes invite me out for drinks or dinner, but I usually have to decline because I either have papers to grade or a shift at the diner. The isolation extends beyond just financial constraints to the fundamental loneliness of being disconnected from any extended family support system. When I get sick, I have to call in substitutes and lose a day's pay because I don't have family members who can help. When my car breaks down, I have to figure out repairs and transportation on my own because there's no family safety net to fall back on. The Sterling relatives live 20 minutes away, but might as well be on another continent for all the support they provide. My friendship with Maria Rodriguez, a fellow teacher at Riverside Elementary, provides the closest thing I have to family support. Maria teaches 4th grade and has become my confidant and partner in navigating the challenges of working in an underfunded school system. She's the one who listens when I'm frustrated with administrators who seem more concerned with test scores than student welfare, and she's the one who celebrates with me when one of my struggling students finally has a breakthrough moment. Maria comes from a large, close-knit family and often invites me to join their gatherings, giving me a glimpse of what supportive family relationships actually look like. Another source of meaning in my life comes from my relationship with Miss Chen, an elderly widow who lives in the apartment next to mine. Mrs. Chen immigrated from Taiwan decades ago and raised 3 children as a single mother after her husband died young, working multiple jobs to put them through college. Now in her 80s, she struggles with mobility issues and occasional confusion, so I help her with grocery shopping and doctor's appointments. Our friendship developed gradually as I realized she had no family nearby and needed assistance with daily tasks that most people take for granted. These relationships contrast sharply with the Sterling family's approach to human connections, which seems to be based entirely on social status and financial advantage. When they attend charity events, it's to be seen with the right people and photographed for society pages rather than to actually help causes they care about. Their friendships appear to be strategic alliances with other wealthy families, designed to maintain their position in elite social circles rather than provide genuine emotional support or companionship. The most painful example of this superficial approach to relationships came during my parents' funeral, when the Sterling family's attendance felt more like a social obligation than genuine grief or support. Robert and Patricia arrived in a black limousine, stayed for exactly the length of the service, and left immediately afterward without offering any practical help or emotional comfort. They didn't ask how I was coping financially or whether I needed assistance with funeral expenses or my parents' estate. They didn't invite me to stay with them while I figured out my next steps or offer any guidance about navigating life as a newly orphaned young adult. Instead, their attitude seemed to be that this tragedy confirmed their worst assumptions about the dangers of living outside their protective bubble of wealth and privilege. My parents died because they were driving an older car on a rainy night when they hit a patch of ice, but I could sense the Sterling family viewing this as somehow inevitable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Given their modest lifestyle, there was an unspoken implication that if my parents had been wealthy enough to afford a newer car with better safety features, or if they'd lived in a neighborhood where they didn't have to drive as far for work, the accident might not have happened. This blame the victim mentality extends to how the Sterling family views my current struggles with student loan debt and my modest lifestyle. Rather than recognizing that I'm working 2 jobs while teaching children and contributing to my community, they seem to see my financial constraints as evidence of poor life choices or insufficient ambition. The idea that someone could work hard and still struggle financially is foreign to people who've never had to worry about money, and they interpret my situation as a moral failing rather than a structural reality of income inequality. The Christmas gatherings at the Sterling estate in Greenwich provide annual reminders of my outsider status within this family hierarchy. The estate itself is a monument to generational wealth with 15 acres of manicured grounds surrounding a Georgian-style mansion that's been featured in architectural magazines. The main house has 12 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, a ballroom, a library, and a wine cellar that Robert stocks with vintages worth more than my annual salary. During family gatherings, the extended Sterling clan fills this space comfortably, but I always feel like an intruder in someone else's natural habitat. The one person who ever saw through the Sterling family's carefully constructed facade was Great-Aunt Margaret herself, though I didn't fully understand this until much later. Margaret Sterling was a formidable woman who commanded respect in business circles and fear among family members who never quite knew where they stood with her. At 78, she remained sharp as a razor, with steel gray hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and eyes that seemed to see straight through people's pretenses to their true character. Unlike the rest of the Sterling clan, Margaret had built her fortune through genuine business acumen rather than inherited privilege, starting with a single rundown apartment building in the Bronx and methodically expanding her empire through shrewd investments and an uncanny ability to predict neighborhood gentrification decades before it happened. While Robert and the other family members assumed they understood Margaret's priorities and values, they fundamentally misread her character and motivation. They saw her business success and assumed she shared their worship of money and status, but Margaret's relationship with wealth was far more complex and nuanced than her relatives realized. She had grown up during the Great Depression and remembered what it felt like to worry about basic necessities, experiences that shaped her understanding of money as a tool for security and opportunity rather than a measure of personal worth. Her decision to remain unmarried and childless wasn't driven by career ambition alone, but by her recognition that most of the men in her social circle were more interested in her fortune than her personality. Margaret's relationship with her family was complicated by her awareness of their flaws and limitations, combined with her genuine hope that they might evolve into better people if given the right incentives and example. She watched her nephew Robert transform from a promising young man into someone whose entire identity revolved around material accumulation and social climate. She observed Patricia's evolution from an intelligent college graduate into a woman whose primary concerns centered on maintaining her position in charity committees and society pages. She witnessed Brandon and Sophia grow up with every advantage money could provide, yet develop into adults who seemed incapable of empathy or genuine achievement. The family's treatment of my branch of the Sterling tree particularly troubled Margaret, who remembered her sister Eleanor with deep affection and regret. Eleanor had been Margaret's closest friend during their childhood, a relationship that survived their parents' disapproval of Eleanor's marriage, but never fully recovered from the social pressures and family expectations that created distance between the sisters. Margaret always felt guilty about not defending Eleanor more forcefully against their parents' criticism, and she carried that regret throughout her life as she watched Eleanor's family struggle financially while the Sterling fortune continued to grow. When my parents died, Margaret was the only family member who truly grieved their loss, rather than viewing it as an unfortunate but predictable consequence of living without adequate financial resources. She had followed my father's career from a distance, respecting his choice to build his own path as a mechanic rather than seeking handouts from wealthy relatives. She admired his integrity and work ethic, qualities that seemed increasingly rare among her immediate family members. My mother had impressed Margaret during their few interactions with her warmth and intelligence, traits that made her early death feel like a genuine loss to the world rather than just a family tragedy. Margaret's interest in my life began long before I was aware of her attention or involvement. During my high school years, when I was focused on academics and college preparation, Margaret was quietly gathering information about my character and potential through methods I wouldn't discover until much later. She hired a discreet private investigator not to spy on me in any invasive way, but to document my daily activities and interactions in a manner that would reveal my true nature when I thought no one important was watching. The investigator's reports painted a detailed picture of a teenager who consistently chose kindness over convenience and integrity over advantage. He documented instances where I helped struggling classmates with homework despite my own heavy academic load, times when I volunteered at local community centers instead of pursuing more prestigious activities that might look better on college applications, and moments when I stood up for students who were being bullied even when it made me a target for social rejection. These behaviors impressed Margaret because they demonstrated character traits that couldn't be taught or bought, qualities that had become increasingly rare in her own family circle. Margaret's decision to anonymously fund my college education through the Educational Excellence Scholarship represented her first major intervention in my life, though she structured it carefully to avoid creating any sense of obligation or dependence. She wanted me to succeed on my own merits, while removing the financial barriers that might prevent me from reaching my potential. The scholarship covered tuition, room, board, and books, allowing me to focus on academics rather than working multiple jobs to pay for my education. Margaret followed my college career through progress reports and grade transcripts, taking quiet pride in my academic achievements and extracurricular involvement. During my junior year of college, Margaret made her first direct contact with me, though I had no idea who she really was at the time. She attended a student teaching demonstration I gave as part of my education program, sitting in the back of the classroom while I led a lesson on creative writing for elementary students. After the demonstration, she approached me with questions about my teaching philosophy and career goals, introducing herself simply as Mrs. Sterling, an education advocate interested in supporting future teachers. Her questions were thoughtful and probing, designed to understand not just my professional ambitions, but my underlying motivations for choosing education as a career. That conversation lasted nearly an hour, covering topics ranging from childhood literacy to educational inequality to the challenges facing urban schools. Margaret was impressed by my passion for teaching and my realistic understanding of the difficulties involved in making a difference within an underfunded system. She particularly appreciated my focus on individual student needs, rather than standardized test scores, and my recognition that many children face obstacles outside school that affect their academic performance. Before leaving, she mentioned that she would be interested in supporting innovative teaching programs, and asked me to stay in touch about my career development. Over the following months, Margaret maintained sporadic contact through emails and occasional phone calls, always framing our relationship as a professional mentorship rather than anything personal or family-related. She asked about my student teaching experiences, offered advice about navigating school bureaucracies, and occasionally sent articles about educational research or teaching methodologies she thought might interest me. These interactions felt natural and helpful rather than suspicious or overly intrusive, though I sometimes wondered why a stranger would take such interest in my career development. After graduation, when I moved to Queens and started teaching at Riverside Elementary, Margaret's support continued in subtle but meaningful ways. The school received an anonymous donation that funded new classroom libraries and art supplies, resources that directly benefited my students and teaching effectiveness. When I mentioned during one of our phone conversations that I was struggling to afford basic classroom materials on my teaching salary, Margaret asked detailed questions about what supplies were most needed and how much they typically cost. Within weeks, Riverside Elementary received another anonymous donation specifically designated for teacher supply reimbursement. Margaret also began attending some of my school's public events, always sitting toward the back and never identifying herself as anything more than a community member interested in supporting local education. She came to our annual science fair, where she watched me help my students present their projects with the kind of pride and enthusiasm that made it clear teaching was more than just a job for me. She attended the school's winter concert, observing how I worked with students who had behavioral challenges and helped them participate successfully in the performance. She even showed up at a Saturday morning reading program I had started for struggling students, noting how I made extra time for children who needed additional support. These observations reinforced Margaret's growing conviction that I possessed the character traits and values she wanted to see in the next generation of Sterling family leadership. Unlike her other relatives, who seemed to view success primarily in terms of personal advancement and material accumulation, I demonstrated a commitment to service and a genuine concern for people who couldn't provide any advantage or benefit in return. My students were mostly from working-class families with limited resources, yet I invested the same energy and creativity in their education that more privileged teachers might reserve for students from wealthy families. Margaret's testing of my character became more sophisticated and deliberate as she developed confidence in my integrity and potential. During my second year of teaching, she arranged for what appeared to be a chance encounter at the grocery store near my apartment, striking up a conversation while we both waited in the checkout line. She mentioned that she was visiting her elderly aunt in the neighborhood and had gotten lost trying to find the woman's apartment building. Without hesitation, I offered to help her navigate the confusing street layout and personally walked her to her destination, even though it meant making a detour that would make me late for my evening shift at the diner. What I didn't know was that Margaret had orchestrated this entire scenario to observe how I would respond to a stranger's request for help when I was clearly in a hurry and had my own obligations to meet. Her supposed elderly aunt was actually a friend who had agreed to participate in this character assessment, and Margaret was testing whether my helpfulness extended beyond my professional obligations to include random acts of kindness for people I had no reason to assume. My willingness to inconvenience myself for someone I'd just met confirmed her assessment of my character and strengthened her resolve to include me in her long-term plan. The pattern of testing continued throughout my early teaching career as Margaret created situations designed to reveal how I would behave when faced with moral choices that had no clear personal benefit. She arranged for me to receive an offer to tutor the child of a wealthy family at a rate that would significantly supplement my teaching income, but the family made it clear they expected me to help their child cheat on standardized test and homework assignment. When I declined the position despite desperately needing the extra money, Margaret knew I had passed another crucial test of integrity over financial temptation. Margaret also monitored how I handled workplace conflicts and professional challenges, particularly my response to administration decisions that prioritized bureaucratic convenience over student welfare. When the school district proposed cutting art and music programs to save money, I organized parent meetings and wrote letters to the school board advocating for these programs' educational value. When a colleague was struggling with classroom management issues that were affecting student learning, I volunteered to mentor her and share teaching strategies rather than complaining about her to administrators. These actions demonstrated leadership qualities and a collaborative approach to problem solving that impressed Margaret and distinguished me from family members who tended to view colleagues as competition rather than potential allies. The most significant test came during my third year of teaching, when I discovered that one of my students was coming to school hungry and wearing dirty clothes because his family was experiencing homelessness. Rather than simply reporting this situation to social services and moving on, I began bringing extra snacks for the child and quietly washing his clothes during lunch breaks so he wouldn't feel self-conscious around his classmates. I also connected his family with local resources for housing assistance and food banks, spending my own weekend time to help them navigate social service bureaucracies and application processes. Margaret learned about this situation through her continued monitoring of my activities, and she was deeply moved by my response to a child in crisis. Rather than treating this as someone else's problem or feeling overwhelmed by circumstances beyond my control, I had taken practical action to address immediate needs while working to solve underlying problems. This demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and compassion Margaret hoped to see in someone who might eventually be responsible for philanthropic initiatives and community investments funded by Sterling Family Resources. As Margaret's confidence in my character grew, she began including me in increasingly significant aspects of her life and business operations, though always in ways that seemed natural rather than suspiciously generous. She mentioned that Sterling Properties was exploring partnerships with educational organizations, and asked if I would be willing to consult on what types of programs might be most beneficial for underserved communities. She invited me to attend charity events where I could network with other education advocates and learn about funding opportunities for innovative teaching programs. These experiences gave me insight into Margaret's own values and priorities, which differed dramatically from what I observed among other Sterling family members at the same events. While Robert and Patricia seemed primarily interested in being photographed with prominent donors and discussing their own charitable contributions in terms of social recognition and tax benefits, Margaret focused on the actual impact of different programs and asked detailed questions about measurable outcomes and long-term sustainability. She was particularly interested in initiatives that addressed systemic problems rather than just providing temporary relief, and she showed genuine respect for people who worked directly with the communities they were trying to help. Margaret's wealth gave her access to information and resources that most people never encounter, but she used these advantages thoughtfully rather than carelessly. When she learned about promising educational research or innovative teaching programs in other cities, she would share this information with me and encourage me to consider how similar approaches might work in my own school. When she met successful educators or nonprofit leaders at various events, she would arrange introductions that could benefit my professional development and expand my understanding of what was possible in public education. Through these interactions, Margaret was not only testing my character but also preparing me for responsibilities I didn't yet know I would inherit. She was exposing me to the complexities of philanthropic decision-making, the challenges of implementing large-scale social programs, and the importance of building relationships with people who shared similar values and goals. She was also modeling a different approach to wealth and power than what I observed among other Sterling family members, demonstrating how resources could be used to create positive change rather than simply maintain personal comfort and social status. The relationship between Margaret and her immediate family members continued to deteriorate during this period, as she became increasingly disappointed with their behavior and priorities. Robert's management of Sterling properties focused heavily on short-term profits and cost-cutting measures that often came at the expense of employee welfare and community relationships. Patricia's charity work seemed designed more to enhance her social standing than to address serious problems, and she frequently complained about having to interact with actual beneficiaries of the programs she supposedly supported. Brandon's approach to work at Sterling Properties exemplified everything Margaret found troubling about the younger generation of her family. Despite his Wharton MBA and official title as Vice President of Development, Brandon showed little interest in learning the business or developing genuine expertise in real estate investment. He preferred to delegate challenging tasks to subordinates while taking credit for successful projects and blaming others when initiatives failed. His expense account showed charges for expensive lunches, golf outings, and entertainment that had questionable business justification, and his attitude toward employees ranged from dismissive to openly hostile. Sophia's lifestyle and career choices particularly frustrated Margaret, who had hoped that someone from the younger generation might use their advantages to pursue meaningful work or contribute something valuable to society. Instead, Sophia had built her entire identity around conspicuous consumption and social media performance, treating her family's wealth as content for her online brand rather than a responsibility that came with obligations to others. Her Instagram account featured endless photos of designer shopping trips, exotic vacations, and luxury experiences, all funded by family money but presented as evidence of her own success and sophistication. The contrast between Sophia's approach to privilege and my response to limited resources became increasingly stark as Margaret observed both of our daily lives during this period. While Sophia complained publicly about minor inconveniences like restaurant wait times or travel delays, I was finding creative solutions to help my students succeed despite inadequate school funding and challenging home situations. While Sophia spent thousands of dollars on single shopping trips for clothes she would wear once, I was spending my weekend time volunteering at community organizations and using my own money to ensure my students had necessary school supplies. Margaret's disappointment with her family's values and behavior was compounded by their treatment of me during the rare occasions when our paths crossed at family events. Even as Margaret began including me in more aspects of her life, the rest of the Sterling family remained dismissive and sometimes openly hostile toward my presence in their social circle. They seemed to view my relationship with Margaret as opportunistic social climbing rather than genuine mentorship, and they made cutting remarks about my clothes, car, and living situation that were designed to remind me of my place in their social hierarchy. These interactions revealed the depth of the Sterling family's sense of entitlement and their inability to recognize merit or character that wasn't accompanied by wealth and status symbol. They couldn't understand why Margaret would waste time on someone like me when she could be cultivating relationships with people who could provide business opportunities or social advantage. Their narrow definition of value and success blinded them to qualities that Margaret increasingly recognized as essential for ethical leadership and meaningful contribution to society. As Margaret approached her 80th birthday, she began making more concrete plans for the distribution of her wealth and the future leadership of her business empire. The Sterling family assumed that Robert would inherit control of the company along with the majority of her personal assets, with smaller bequests going to other family members based on their perceived contributions and loyalty. They had no idea that Margaret was considering a completely different approach to succession planning, one that prioritized character over bloodline and moral leadership over business experience. Margaret's vision for the Sterling legacy involved using the family's accumulated wealth to address systemic problems in education, housing, and community development, rather than simply maintaining the lavish lifestyles her relatives had grown accustomed to. She wanted to see Sterling Properties become a model for ethical business practices and community investment, rather than just a vehicle for generating maximum profits for family members. She envisioned the Sterling Foundation growing into a major force for social change, funding innovative programs and supporting grassroots organizations that were actually making a difference in people's lives. The question that occupied Margaret's thoughts during her final years was who could be trusted to carry out this vision with integrity and effectiveness. Robert had the business experience, but lacked the moral compass and genuine commitment to social responsibility that such a role would require. David and Helen had comfortable lives and prestigious careers, but showed no interest in using their advantages to benefit anyone beyond their immediate families. The younger generation seemed even more self-centered and disconnected from any sense of social obligation or community responsibility. Margaret's solution to this succession dilemma was radical by traditional family standards, but logical given her values and priorities. Rather than automatically defaulting to bloodline succession or choosing the family member with the most business experience, she decided to select the person who had demonstrated the character traits and commitment to service that would best serve the Sterling legacy's higher purpose. This meant recognizing that the most qualified candidate might not be the most obvious choice from a conventional perspective, but would be the right choice for the kind of future she envisioned for the family's resources and influence. Margaret's final years were marked by increasingly deliberate documentation of her family's behavior and character, creating what would eventually become a comprehensive record of their moral failures and my genuine commitment to serve. She maintained detailed journals that recorded not just business transactions and investment decisions, but also family interactions, charitable giving patterns, and responses to various ethical challenges she created for different relatives. These journals would later serve as irrefutable evidence of why she chose to structure her will in a way that shocked everyone who thought they understood her priorities and values. The depth of Margaret's disappointment with her immediate family became apparent through a series of incidents during her final 3 years that revealed their true character when they thought no one important was watching. Robert's handling of a tenant dispute at one of Sterling Properties' residential buildings exemplified his approach to business relationships and social responsibility. When elderly tenants in a rent-stabilized building complained about inadequate heating during a particularly harsh winter, Robert's solution was to initiate eviction proceedings against the most vocal complainers, rather than address the underlying maintenance problems that were causing the heating issue. Margaret learned about this situation when one of the affected tenants contacted her directly, having found her name listed as the building's owner in city records. The elderly woman explained that she had lived in her apartment for 23 years and had always paid her rent on time, but was now facing eviction because she had organized other tenants to demand basic services they were legally entitled to receive. When Margaret investigated further, she discovered that Robert had deliberately deferred necessary boiler repairs to save money, calculating that the resulting tenant complaints could be used as justification for converting the building to market-rate units that would generate higher profit. This incident revealed Robert's willingness to prioritize short-term financial gains over tenant welfare and legal obligations, demonstrating exactly the kind of ethical blindness that Margaret found increasingly intolerable. She quietly arranged for the necessary heating repairs to be completed and the eviction proceedings to be dropped, but she also documented Robert's behavior in detail, as evidence of his unfitness for future leadership of the family business. The tenants never learned that Margaret had intervened on their behalf, but Robert's reaction to being overruled provided additional insight into his character and priorities. Rather than acknowledging that his approach had been inappropriate or learning from Margaret's correction, Robert complained bitterly about her interference in his management decisions and her failure to support his authority within the company. He seemed genuinely unable to understand why tenant welfare should take precedence over profit maximization, and he expressed frustration that Margaret was allowing her age and declining health to affect her business judgment. These complaints, which he shared with other family members, revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of Margaret's values and his assumption that her wealth-building success meant she shared his callous approach to human relationships. Patricia's response to various charitable obligations during this period provided equally damaging evidence of her character and motivations. When the private school that Sophia had attended requested donations for a scholarship fund to support students from low-income families, Patricia initially agreed to contribute, but then attempted to structure her donation in a way that would ensure the scholarship recipients were excluded from social events and extracurricular activities that might bring them into contact with full-paying students. She explained to other board members that while she supported educational opportunities for deserving poor children, She didn't think it was appropriate for them to participate in activities that might make them feel entitled to access they couldn't afford on their own. Margaret learned about Patricia's conditions when the school's development director contacted her to ask if Sterling Properties might be willing to provide additional funding to cover the full cost of scholarship recipients' participation in school activities. The director explained that Patricia's restrictions would essentially create a two-tiered system that would stigmatize scholarship students and undermine the program's educational goal. Margaret immediately agreed to provide the additional funding while privately documenting Patricia's behavior as another example of the family's inability to understand the purpose and ethics of genuine philanthropy. The contrast between Patricia's approach to charitable giving and my own volunteer work became increasingly stark during this period, as Margaret continued to observe both of our activities. While Patricia viewed charity as a social obligation that should enhance her reputation and provide networking opportunities with other wealthy donors, I was spending my weekends working directly with people who needed assistance, often in ways that provided no recognition or social benefit. Margaret documented instances where I had driven elderly neighbors to medical appointments, helped immigrant families navigate bureaucratic processes, and organized food drives for families affected by job losses or medical emergency. Brandon's behavior during his final years working at Sterling Properties provided perhaps the most egregious examples of entitlement and incompetence that Margaret recorded in her journal. Despite his executive title and substantial salary, Brandon showed little interest in actually learning the real estate business or developing the skills necessary for effective leadership. He preferred to spend his time at expensive restaurants and golf courses, claiming these activities were essential for building client relationships. But Margaret's investigation revealed that most of his so-called business meetings were actually social gatherings with friends who had no connection to Sterling Property. The breaking point came when Margaret discovered that Brandon had been using company resources to fund a luxury vacation to Dubai that he had presented as a business development trip to explore international investment opportunities. When she requested a detailed report on his findings and potential investment prospects, Brandon submitted a superficial document that appeared to be largely copied from tourism websites and real estate marketing material. He had obviously spent his time shopping, dining, and partying rather than conducting any serious business research, yet he had charged the entire trip to the company and claimed it as a business expense on his taxes. Margaret confronted Brandon directly about this fraudulent expense report, giving him an opportunity to explain his actions and demonstrate some understanding of why his behavior was problematic. Instead of acknowledging his mistakes or showing any remorse, Brandon became defensive and argumentative, claiming that his work stress entitled him to occasional luxury experiences, and that Margaret was being unreasonably demanding about documentation and accountability. He seemed genuinely surprised that she expected him to produce actual business results in exchange for his salary and benefits, revealing a fundamental misunderstanding of professional responsibility and work ethic. Sophia's evolution during Margaret's final years demonstrated an even more troubling trajectory as she became increasingly narcissistic and disconnected from reality. Her social media presence grew more elaborate and expensive, featuring constant displays of designer clothing, exotic travel, and luxury experiences that were funded entirely by family money, but presented as evidence of her own success and entrepreneurial spirit. She began describing herself as a lifestyle entrepreneur and brand influencer, despite having no actual business or source of independent income beyond her family's wealth. Margaret was particularly disturbed by Sophia's treatment of service workers and people she considered beneath her social status. During family gatherings, Margaret observed Sophia speaking rudely to restaurant servers, household staff, and delivery workers, treating them as invisible or annoying obstacles rather than human beings deserving basic respect. When Sophia's car broke down during one family event, she berated the tow truck driver for taking too long to arrive and complained loudly about having to wait in an unfamiliar neighborhood, surrounded by people she described as obviously poor and probably dangerous. These incidents revealed a level of cruelty and prejudice that Margaret found deeply concerning, especially since Sophia had grown up with every advantage and opportunity that wealth could provide. Rather than developing empathy and social consciousness, Sophia had become increasingly entitled and contemptuous of anyone who didn't share her privileged position. Margaret documented these observations carefully, recognizing that Sophia's character defects made her completely unsuitable for any role in managing family resources or representing the Sterling name in philanthropic activity. The extended family members provided additional examples of moral failure and character deficiency that reinforced Margaret's growing conviction that traditional inheritance patterns would be disastrous for the Sterling legacy. David's investment banking career had involved several questionable deals that prioritized his commission income over his clients' best interest, including steering elderly investors into high-risk products that generated substantial fees for his firm while exposing retirees to potential financial ruin. When one of these clients lost most of his retirement savings in a market downturn, David showed no remorse or sense of responsibility, instead blaming the client for not understanding the risks involved. Helen's legal career had followed a similar pattern of prioritizing personal advancement over ethical obligation, including her willingness to represent clients in cases where she knew their claims were fraudulent or her advice was designed to help them evade legal responsibilities rather than comply with their obligations. Margaret learned about several instances where Helen had used her legal expertise to help wealthy clients avoid paying legitimate debts to small businesses and working-class contractors who had provided services in good faith but lacked the resources to pursue complex litigation. The younger generation of extended family members showed even less promise, with Michael and Matthew Sterling displaying the same combination of entitlement and incompetence that characterized their cousin. Despite receiving expensive educations at elite universities, both young men seemed primarily interested in maintaining their comfortable lifestyles without contributing anything meaningful to society or even their own family's business interests. Their college years had been marked by academic mediocrity, social irresponsibility, and a series of incidents involving alcohol abuse and poor judgment that had required family connections and financial resources to resolve without serious consequence. Caroline Morrison's law degree from a prestigious university had been achieved through family connections and generous donations rather than merit-based admission, and her subsequent career had followed a similar pattern of advancement through privilege rather than competence. Margaret discovered that Caroline had failed the bar exam twice before finally passing on her third attempt, and even then had required extensive tutoring and preparation assistance that most law students couldn't afford. Despite these academic struggles, Caroline had been hired by a prestigious law firm primarily because of her family connections and the promise of future business from Sterling property. During this same period, Margaret's observation of my daily life and professional development continued to provide evidence of character traits that distinguished me from her other relatives in fundamental ways. My teaching career was progressing well, with consistent positive evaluations from administrators and genuine affection from students and parents who appreciated my dedication and creativity. Margaret learned that I had been selected to participate in a competitive summer institute for innovative teaching methods, an honor that reflected both my classroom effectiveness and my commitment to professional growth. My volunteer work had also expanded during Margaret's final years as I became involved with a nonprofit organization that provided educational support for children in foster care. These students faced unique challenges that required extra patience and specialized approaches, and my willingness to invest time and emotional energy in helping them succeed impressed Margaret as another example of my commitment to service over personal convenience. The organization's director had specifically requested my participation because of my reputation for working effectively with students who had experienced trauma or instability in their home life. Margaret arranged to observe some of my work with these foster children by volunteering at the same organization, though I never knew she was there specifically to watch me. She was deeply moved by my interactions with children who had every reason to distrust adults and authority figures, noting how I created safe spaces where they could express their feelings and fears without judgment. She observed my ability to maintain appropriate boundaries while still showing genuine care and concern, a skill that required both professional training and natural empathy. One particular incident that Margaret documented involved a 12-year-old girl who had been placed in multiple foster homes and was exhibiting behavioral problems that made her difficult to work with in traditional educational settings. Most volunteers struggled to engage this child constructively, but I spent extra time learning about her interests and experiences, eventually discovering that she had a talent for creative writing that had never been recognized or encouraged. I helped her develop this skill while using writing exercises as a way to process some of her emotional challenges, and over several months her behavior and academic performance improved dramatically. Margaret was particularly impressed by my approach to this situation because it demonstrated several qualities she considered essential for effective leadership and philanthropy. I had taken time to understand the root causes of the child's difficulties rather than simply trying to manage her symptoms. I had recognized and nurtured her individual strengths rather than focusing only on her deficits and problems. I had maintained consistent support and encouragement even when progress was slow and setbacks occurred. Most importantly, I had celebrated the child's achievements without taking credit for her success, recognizing that she had done the difficult work of healing and growth herself. The contrast between my response to challenging situations and my relative's approach to similar problems became a recurring theme in Margaret's observations and documentation. When Brandon encountered difficulties with demanding clients or complex projects at Sterling Properties, his typical response was to delegate responsibility to subordinates while distancing himself from potential blame if things went wrong. When Sophia faced criticism or negative feedback about her social media content or public behavior, she generally responded with defensiveness and attacks on her critics rather than self-reflection or genuine attempts at improvement. Margaret's health began declining noticeably during her final year, though she remained mentally sharp and fully capable of making complex decisions about her estate and business interests. She used this period to finalize her plans for wealth distribution and succession, consulting with trusted legal and financial advisors who helped her structure arrangements that would achieve her goals while minimizing opportunities for family members to challenge her decisions through litigation. The complexity of these arrangements reflected both the size of her estate and her determination to ensure that her wealth would be used responsibly rather than simply inherited by people who felt entitled to. The decision to create a separate $50 million educational trust with me as the sole beneficiary represented the culmination of Margaret's years of observation and character assessment. This trust was structured specifically to support educational initiatives and community development projects, with strict guidelines about how the funds could be used and requirements for regular reporting on the impact and effectiveness of funded programs. Margaret designed these restrictions not because she didn't trust my judgment, but because she wanted to ensure that the money would continue serving educational purposes for generations, rather than being diverted to personal use or inappropriate investment. Margaret's choice to leave the bulk of her personal assets to me while giving only symbolic bequests to her immediate family members was driven by her conviction that character and values should take precedence over bloodline relationships in determining inheritance. She had spent years documenting evidence that Robert, Patricia, Brandon, Sophia, and the other family members lacked the moral foundation necessary for responsible stewardship of significant wealth. Their patterns of behavior consistently demonstrated selfishness, entitlement, and indifference to the welfare of others, qualities that made them unsuitable guardians of resources that could potentially benefit countless people if managed properly. The legal documents Margaret prepared during her final months included detailed explanations of her reasoning and extensive documentation of the character assessments that had guided her decision. She knew that her choices would be controversial and possibly contested, so she wanted to provide clear evidence that her mental capacity had remained intact and that her decisions were based on years of careful observation rather than sudden whims or temporary disappointment. These documents would later prove crucial in defending her will against the inevitable challenges from family members who felt cheated out of their expected inheritance. Margaret's final months were also marked by increased contact with me, though she continued to frame our relationship in terms of professional mentorship rather than revealing her true intentions or family connection. She began introducing me to other wealthy philanthropists and foundation leaders, ostensibly to help me understand funding opportunities for educational programs, but actually to prepare me for the responsibilities I would soon inherit. These introductions provided valuable networking opportunities while also giving Margaret confidence that I would have access to experienced advisors who could help me navigate the complexities of managing substantial philanthropic resources. The irony of this situation was that while Margaret was carefully preparing me for responsibilities I didn't know I would inherit, Her immediate family members were making increasingly elaborate plans for how they would use their expected windfall. Robert had already begun discussions with investment advisors about expanding Sterling Properties into new markets, assuming he would inherit both the company and sufficient capital to fund aggressive growth strategy. Patricia had commissioned architects to design renovations for the Greenwich estate and had begun planning an expensive European art buying trip to enhance the family's collection. Brandon and Sophia had made even more extravagant assumptions about their future inheritance, with Brandon putting deposits down on a luxury yacht and a vacation property in the Caribbean, while Sophia had begun negotiations to purchase a penthouse apartment in Manhattan that would serve as a backdrop for her social media empire. Neither of them had any realistic understanding of how much money might actually be available for distribution, but both had convinced themselves that their family connection guaranteed them access to virtually unlimited resources. The extended family members had made similar assumptions about their expected bequests, with several relatives making investment decisions and lifestyle changes based on anticipated inheritance income that would never materialize. David had committed to funding his son's graduate school educations at expensive private universities, while Helen had made a substantial donation pledge to her alma mater that she expected to fulfill using inheritance money. These premature financial commitments would later create additional pressure to challenge Margaret's will when the actual bequests proved far smaller than anyone had expected. Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday morning in late spring, leaving behind a carefully crafted legacy plan that would soon turn the Sterling family's world upside down. Her immediate family members received notification of her death through formal channels, and began making funeral arrangements that reflected their assumptions about their new roles as inheritors of substantial wealth and social prominence. They had no idea that within weeks, their comfortable assumptions about family hierarchy and financial security would be completely shattered by revelations that would force them to confront uncomfortable truths about their own character and worthiness. Margaret's funeral took place on a gray Thursday morning at St. James Episcopal Church in Greenwich, a venue that perfectly suited the Sterling family's desire to project an image of dignified grief while networking with other wealthy mourners who might prove useful for future business or social opportunities. The service itself was orchestrated by Patricia, with the same attention to appearances that characterized everything else about the Sterling approach to public events. She had selected expensive floral arrangements, hired a renowned organist, and invited a carefully curated guest list that included prominent business leaders, society figures, and potential clients for Sterling Properties. Robert delivered the primary eulogy, presenting a sanitized version of Margaret's life that emphasized her business achievements and philanthropic activities, while carefully omitting any mention of her complex relationship with the family or her growing disappointment with their values and behavior. He spoke eloquently about her pioneering role in real estate development and her contributions to various charitable organizations, painting a picture of a devoted family matriarch who had dedicated her life to building a legacy that would benefit future generations. The mourners nodded approvingly at his words, unaware that they were hearing a carefully constructed fiction designed to enhance the family's reputation rather than honor Margaret's true character and motivation. I sat in the back row of the church, feeling simultaneously grateful for the opportunity to say goodbye to Margaret and deeply uncomfortable with the theatrical nature of the proceeding. None of the Sterling family members had directly invited me to attend, but Patricia had grudgingly included me when the funeral director mentioned that Margaret had specifically requested my presence in her final instruction. My modest black dress and simple appearance stood out starkly among the designer mourning attire worn by other attendees, and I could feel curious glances from people who were obviously wondering why someone like me had been important enough to merit inclusion in this exclusive gathering. The disconnect between the Margaret being celebrated in Robert's eulogy and the woman I had known through our mentoring relationship was painful to witness. Robert described her as someone who valued family above all else, and who had devoted her life to ensuring the Sterling legacy would continue to benefit future generations. He spoke about her business acumen and her ability to identify profitable investments, presenting her wealth accumulation as evidence of her dedication to providing security and opportunities for her loved one. These characterizations bore little resemblance to the thoughtful, principled woman who had spent years documenting her family's moral failures and planning to redirect their inheritance toward more worthy recipients. Brandon and Sophia sat in the front row with expressions of appropriate grief, though I noticed both of them checking their phones periodically and whispering to each other during the service. Sophia had posted several social media updates about attending her great-aunt's funeral, complete with carefully staged photos that showcased her expensive mourning outfit and generated sympathetic comments from her followers. Brandon appeared restless and eager for the ceremony to conclude, probably because he was anxious to begin the inheritance process that he assumed would soon make him significantly wealthier than he already was. The extended family members filled several rows behind the immediate heirs, all projecting similar combinations of grief and barely concealed anticipation about the financial implications of Margaret's death. David Sterling kept checking his watch and exchanging meaningful glances with his wife Jennifer, while Helen Sterling Morrison maintained her lawyer's poker face, but couldn't completely hide the calculating look in her eyes as she surveyed the other mourners and mentally assessed the potential value of Margaret's estate. Their children sat quietly but restlessly, obviously coached to behave appropriately but clearly bored by the lengthy service and religious ceremony. After the funeral, the Sterling family hosted a reception at their Greenwich estate, transforming Margaret's memorial into another opportunity for social networking and business relationship building. The gathering took place in the mansion's grand ballroom, with caterers serving expensive hors d'oeuvres and premium liquor to guests who seemed more interested in discussing real estate markets and investment opportunities than sharing memories of the deceased. Patricia moved through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting condolences while simultaneously promoting Sterling properties and hinting about exciting expansion plans that would soon be possible thanks to Margaret's legacy. I felt completely out of place at this reception, surrounded by people whose conversations revolved around stock prices, luxury travel, and exclusive social events that represented a world I had never experienced and frankly didn't want to join. Several guests asked me how I had known Margaret, and when I explained our professional mentoring relationship, they seemed confused about why a public school teacher would have warranted personal attention from someone of Margaret's stature and influence. Their questions weren't overtly rude, but they carried implicit assumptions about social hierarchy and appropriate relationships that made it clear I was viewed as an anomaly in this setting. Margaret's attorney, William Carter, attended both the funeral and reception, but maintained a professional distance from the family celebrations, observing the proceedings with the detached interest of someone who knew secrets that would soon transform this entire gathering. Carter was a distinguished man in his early 60s who had represented the Sterling family for over 3 decades, during which time he had witnessed their evolution from a relatively modest real estate business into a substantial fortune built through Margaret's exceptional business instincts and tireless work ethic. He alone understood the true contents of Margaret's will and the shock that awaited her relatives when they learned how drastically their expectations diverged from reality. The reading of Margaret's will was scheduled for the following Monday afternoon at Carter's law offices in downtown Manhattan, giving the family several days to solidify their assumptions about inheritance distribution and make increasingly detailed plans for their expected windfall. Robert spent the weekend reviewing Sterling Properties' financial statements and meeting with investment advisors to discuss expansion strategies that would leverage his anticipated inheritance to grow the company's portfolio. Patricia used the time to finalize renovation plans for the Greenwich estate and schedule consultations with interior designers who specialized in historic mansion restoration. Brandon's weekend activities involved visiting yacht dealers and luxury car showrooms, convinced that his inheritance would soon allow him to upgrade his lifestyle in ways that would enhance his social media presence and personal brand. He had already begun bragging to friends about his upcoming wealth increase, making reservations at exclusive restaurants and private clubs that he expected to join once his financial situation improved. Sophia similarly spent her time planning expensive purchases and experiences, including a potential collaboration with a luxury fashion brand that she assumed would be interested in partnering with someone about to inherit substantial wealth. The extended family members engaged in similar premature celebration and financial planning, with David Sterling scheduling meetings with private wealth managers to discuss investment strategies for his expected inheritance. Helen Sterling Morrison began researching high-end real estate purchases and private school options for her daughter Caroline's future children. While Michael and Matthew Sterling made plans for expensive graduate programs and gap-year travel experiences that they assumed would soon be easily affordable through family money. None of these relatives had any realistic understanding of Margaret's actual intentions or the careful documentation she had accumulated over years of observing their behavior and character. They had convinced themselves that blood relationship automatically entitled them to inherit substantial wealth, regardless of their personal qualities or contributions to the family legacy. Their assumptions reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of Margaret's values and priorities, as well as their own sense of entitlement that had been reinforced by decades of privileged living funded by family resources. Monday morning arrived with unseasonably warm weather that seemed to mock the gravity of the occasion awaiting the Sterling family. Carter's law offices occupied several floors of a prestigious Manhattan building with elegant conference rooms designed to accommodate complex estate proceedings and sensitive family discussion. The main conference room featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, expensive mahogany furniture, and oil paintings that projected an atmosphere of stability and tradition that would soon be shattered by the contents of Margaret's final testament. The Sterling family members arrived throughout the early afternoon, each dressed in business attire that reflected their expectations about the serious financial discussions that would shape their future. Robert wore his most expensive suit and gold cufflinks that had belonged to his father, projecting the image of a successful businessman ready to assume greater responsibilities and manage increased wealth. Patricia had chosen a conservative dress and pearl accessories that suggested both appropriate grief and readiness for the social obligations that would accompany her elevated financial status. Brandon appeared confident and relaxed, having spent the morning at his gym and spa preparing for what he anticipated would be a life-changing afternoon. He carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who had never doubted his place in the family hierarchy or his right to inherit substantial wealth without having earned it through personal achievement or contribution. Sophia arrived slightly late, having stopped for professional photos that would document this important moment in her family's history for her social media followers, who had been eagerly awaiting updates about her inheritance prospects. The extended family members filled the remaining seats around the large conference table, creating an atmosphere of expectant celebration barely disguised as solemn legal proceedings. David Sterling reviewed documents on his phone while Jennifer whispered calculations about potential inheritance amounts based on various assumptions about Margaret's total wealth. Helen Sterling Morrison sat with her lawyer's notebook ready to take detailed notes about legal implications and tax strategies that would optimize their family's financial benefit from the estate distribution. I arrived last, having taken the subway from Queens after finishing my morning classes at Riverside Elementary. My modest appearance and obvious discomfort in this expensive legal setting reinforced the family's assumptions about my marginal role in the proceedings. Several relatives exchanged knowing glances when I entered the conference room, clearly wondering why someone of my limited means and social status had been included in such an important family financial discussion. Their expressions suggested amusement mixed with mild irritation that Margaret had insisted on including me in what they considered a private family matter. Carter began the proceedings with standard legal formalities, explaining the probate process and reviewing the basic structure of Margaret's estate before moving to the specific bequests and distributions outlined in her will. The family members listened with polite attention while mentally calculating their expected shares and planning how they would use their inheritance to enhance their already comfortable lifestyle. The atmosphere in the room was one of barely contained excitement, as everyone waited to learn exactly how much wealthier they were about to become. The initial bequests proceeded exactly as the family had expected, with Margaret leaving jewelry and personal items to Patricia, Robert receiving a collection of antique furniture and artwork, and various extended family members getting modest financial gifts that seemed appropriate for their relationship to the deceased. These preliminary distributions followed traditional patterns and reinforced the family's confidence that the major assets would be allocated according to conventional inheritance hierarchies that favored immediate relatives and longest-serving family members. Carter then moved to the primary estate distributions, beginning with Margaret's real estate holdings and business interests that represented the bulk of her accumulated wealth. The family members leaned forward in anticipation as he prepared to announce what they assumed would be Robert's inheritance of Sterling properties and the majority of Margaret's investment portfolio. The silence in the room was complete as everyone focused on hearing the specific amounts and terms that would determine their financial futures for the rest of their lives. Instead of the expected announcement of Robert's inheritance, Carter began reading a section of the will that stunned everyone present into shocked silence. Margaret had left the Greenwich estate to a historical preservation society with instructions that it be converted into a museum showcasing the evolution of American real estate development. Sterling Properties was being donated to a nonprofit foundation dedicated to developing affordable housing for working families, with strict instructions that profits be reinvested in community development rather than distributed to shareholders or family members. The family's reaction was initially one of confused disbelief rather than anger, as they struggled to process information that contradicted everything they had assumed about Margaret's intentions and value. Robert's face went completely white as he realized that his expected inheritance of the family business had been replaced by a charitable donation that would eliminate his control over the company he had been managing for 15 years. Patricia began shaking her head in denial, unable to accept that the estate she had considered her future home was being converted into a public institution rather than remaining in family hands. Brandon and Sophia sat in stunned silence as the implications of these revelations began to sink in, realizing that their elaborate spending plans and lifestyle expectations had been based on assumptions that were proving completely wrong. The extended family members looked equally shocked and confused, frantically trying to understand how their wealthy aunt could have made decisions that seemed to prioritize strangers and charitable causes over her own blood relatives who had expected to benefit from her lifetime of wealth accumulation. Carter continued reading Margaret's will with professional composure despite the growing tension and disbelief in the conference room. He announced that Margaret's extensive investment portfolio, valued at approximately $37 million, was being distributed among various educational and social service organizations that had demonstrated effective programs for helping disadvantaged communities. Her art collection was going to public museums, her jewelry to be auctioned with proceeds funding scholarships for first-generation college students, and her luxury vehicles to be sold with the money supporting job training programs for unemployed workers. The family members began interrupting Carter's reading with increasingly desperate questions and objections, unable to believe that Margaret had chosen to essentially disinherit her immediate relatives in favor of charitable causes and social programs. Robert demanded to know whether Margaret had been mentally competent when she signed this will, while Patricia insisted that there must have been some mistake or misunderstanding that could be corrected through legal action. Brandon accused Carter of misreading the documents or deliberately misrepresenting Margaret's intentions, while Sophia began crying and claiming that her great-aunt had been manipulated by opportunistic advisors. The chaos and accusations continued for several minutes before Carter managed to restore order by announcing that Margaret had anticipated these reactions and had prepared both video documentation of her mental competency and detailed written explanations of her reasoning for each decision. He explained that she had undergone comprehensive psychological evaluations within 6 months of her death specifically to prevent any successful challenges to her will based on claims of diminished capacity or undue influence by outside parties. As the initial shock began to wear off, the family's reaction shifted from disbelief to anger and desperate attempts to find legal grounds for challenging Margaret's decision. David Sterling immediately began questioning Carter about potential loopholes or technicalities that might invalidate the charitable bequests, while Helen Sterling Morrison demanded copies of all documents so she could review them for procedural errors or legal violations. The extended family members joined this chorus of challenges and threats, convinced that their blood relationship to Margaret must provide some basis for overturning what they considered an obviously irrational and unfair distribution of her wealth. Carter allowed these protests to continue for several minutes before raising his hand for silence and announcing that there were additional provisions in Margaret's will that specifically addressed the family members present in the room. The Sterling relatives immediately focused their attention on this announcement, hoping that Margaret had included separate bequests for them that would provide the financial security they had been expecting. Their expressions showed renewed optimism as they waited to learn about these additional provisions that might salvage their inheritance expectations. What Carter announced next completely shattered any remaining hope the Sterling family might have harbored about benefiting from Margaret's estate. Rather than providing them with additional bequests, Margaret had used this section of her will to document specific examples of their moral failures and character defects that had led to their disinheritance. She had left detailed accounts of Robert's exploitation of tenants, Patricia's discriminatory charity work, Brandon's fraudulent business expenses, and Sophia's cruel treatment of service workers, along with similar documentation of the extended family members' ethical failures and selfish behavior. These revelations were accompanied by Margaret's explanation that she had spent years testing and evaluating each family member's character, through carefully designed situations that revealed their true priorities and values. She had documented their responses to various moral challenges and opportunities for demonstrating compassion and integrity, creating a comprehensive record of their consistent failures to meet even basic standards of human decency and social responsibility. The humiliation of having their worst behaviors exposed and criticized in this formal legal setting was devastating for family members who had convinced themselves they were good people deserving of inherited wealth and social respect. Robert's exploitation of vulnerable tenants was presented as evidence of his unfitness for business leadership, while Patricia's discriminatory attitudes toward scholarship recipients revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of genuine philanthropy and social responsibility. Carter then delivered the final blow that would completely transform my life and position within the Sterling family hierarchy. Margaret had created a separate $50 million educational trust with me as the sole beneficiary, specifically designed to fund innovative educational programs and community development initiatives that would address systemic problems rather than just providing temporary relief for individual cases. This trust was structured with careful legal protections that would make it impossible for the Sterling family to challenge or claim any portion of these funds through litigation or other legal action. The announcement of my inheritance created a moment of absolute silence in the conference room as everyone struggled to process this unprecedented reversal of their expectations and assumptions. The woman they had dismissed and marginalized for years had just inherited more money than most of them had expected to receive from Margaret's entire estate, while they were left with symbolic bequests and the humiliation of having their character defects publicly documented and criticized. Robert was the first to break the silence with an explosion of rage and disbelief that echoed through the conference room and probably carried into the hallway beyond. He accused me of manipulating Margaret through false friendship and calculated deception, claiming that I had obviously spent years pretending to be a caring mentee while actually scheming to steal his rightful inheritance through emotional manipulation and exploitation of an elderly woman's loneliness and vulnerability. Patricia joined this attack with equally vicious accusations, claiming that my modest lifestyle and teaching career had been elaborate performances designed to gain Margaret's sympathy and convince her that I was more deserving than her actual family member. She suggested that I had deliberately cultivated an image of struggling virtue while secretly plotting to claim wealth that rightfully belonged to people who shared Margaret's blood and had supported her throughout her life. Brandon and Sophia's reactions were even more dramatic and personally insulting, with Brandon calling me pathetic and accusing me of being a gold-digging social climber who had targeted a vulnerable elderly woman for financial exploitation. Sophia screamed that I was a nobody who had somehow tricked her way into wealth I could never deserve or properly manage, and she threatened to expose my supposed fraud through social media campaigns and legal action that would destroy my reputation and career. The extended family members joined this chorus of accusations and threats, with David Sterling promising immediate legal action to contest the will and recover what he considered stolen family assets. Helen Sterling Morrison began taking notes for what she obviously intended to be a comprehensive legal challenge based on claims of undue influence, fraud, and Margaret's alleged mental incompetence during her final year. Through all these attacks and accusations, I sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened and struggling to process the reality that Margaret had chosen me to inherit responsibility for managing $50 million in educational funds. The amount of money was so large that I couldn't immediately comprehend what it would mean for my life or how I would handle the enormous responsibility that came with such resources. Carter eventually restored order by explaining that Margaret had anticipated these exact reactions and had prepared comprehensive legal documentation that would make any challenges to her will both expensive and ultimately unsuccessful. She had included specific provisions that would result in the complete forfeiture of any remaining bequests for family members who attempted to contest the will or interfere with the trust's operation, creating powerful financial incentives for them to accept her decisions rather than pursue costly litigation. As the Sterling family members gradually realized that their inheritance expectations had been permanently destroyed and that I had emerged as the primary beneficiary of Margaret's wealth, their anger shifted into desperate attempts at negotiation and manipulation. Robert offered to let me work at Sterling Properties in exchange for sharing the trust money, while Patricia suggested that we could collaborate on charitable projects that would benefit both our interests and restore family harmony. Brandon and Sophia attempted different approaches, with Brandon claiming that we had always been close cousins who should support each other, and Sophia suddenly remembering positive interactions we had supposedly shared during family gatherings. These transparent attempts at manipulation revealed their assumption that I would be easily influenced by false friendship and family pressure, demonstrating that they still didn't understand the character traits that had impressed Margaret and led to her decision to trust me with her legacy. The meeting concluded with the Sterling family members storming out of the conference room in various states of rage, humiliation, and desperate determination to find some way to reverse or challenge Margaret's decision. Their threats of legal action and personal retaliation echoed through the hallway as they departed, leaving me alone with Carter to begin the overwhelming process of understanding my new responsibilities and the complex legal structures Margaret had created to ensure her wealth would be used for educational and social benefit rather than personal enrichment. 6 months later, I had moved from my studio apartment in Queens to a modest but comfortable home near my school, using a small portion of the trust income to improve my living situation while maintaining my teaching career and commitment to public education. The Sterling Properties Affordable Housing Foundation had begun its first development project, converting luxury condominiums into workforce housing for teachers, nurses, and other essential workers who had been priced out of the communities they served. The Sterling family's attempts to challenge Margaret's will had failed completely, resulting in substantial legal fees and the forfeiture of their remaining small bequests as Margaret had specified in her carefully crafted final testament. Robert had been forced to find new employment after the foundation board declined to retain him as Sterling Properties CEO, while Patricia's social standing had suffered dramatically when news of the will's contents became public knowledge throughout their elite social circle. Brandon and Sophia had been compelled to significantly downsize their lifestyles and find actual employment to support themselves, experiences that were providing them with their first real exposure to the working world that most people navigate without family wealth as a safety net. The extended family members had similarly been forced to adjust their expectations and spending patterns, learning that blood relationship alone was insufficient to guarantee inherited financial security. Margaret's vision for using Sterling wealth to address educational inequality and community development was becoming reality through carefully planned initiatives that prioritized long-term impact over short-term relief. The trust funded teacher training programs, community college scholarships, and innovative school improvement projects that demonstrated measurable results and sustainable growth rather than merely providing temporary assistance to individual recipients. Standing in my new home study, surrounded by educational research and grant proposals from organizations seeking trust funding, I finally understood the full magnitude of Margaret's gift and the responsibilities she had entrusted to me. Her decision to bypass traditional inheritance patterns in favor of character-based succession had created opportunities for positive change that would extend far beyond my own life and benefit countless people who would never know her name, but would experience the impact of her values and vision. The Sterling family's assumption that wealth automatically belonged to blood relatives had been replaced by Margaret's demonstration that true legacy comes from using resources to create positive change, rather than simply maintaining family privilege across generations. Their shock and anger at losing their expected inheritance revealed the depth of their entitlement and their fundamental misunderstanding of what Margaret had actually valued throughout her remarkable life. Through Margaret's careful planning and my commitment to honoring her trust, the Sterling fortune would continue generating positive impact long after the family members who had felt entitled to inherit it had been forgotten by history. The educational programs and community development initiatives funded by her wealth would create opportunities for countless individuals to achieve their potential and contribute to society in ways that money alone could never accomplish. 5 years after the will reading that transformed my life and shattered the Sterling family's sense of entitlement, I stood before the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Margaret Sterling Community Education Center in East Harlem, watching hundreds of neighborhood children and families celebrate the opening of a facility that would serve their community for generations to come. The building had been constructed using innovative sustainable design principles and housed not only traditional classrooms, but also maker spaces, art studios, computer labs, and a commercial kitchen where local residents could develop culinary skills and small business venture. The transformation of this abandoned warehouse into a vibrant educational hub represented exactly the kind of systematic change that Margaret had envisioned when she entrusted me with her wealth. Rather than simply writing checks to existing organizations, the Margaret Sterling Educational Trust had developed a comprehensive approach to community development that addressed multiple interconnected challenges facing underserved neighborhoods. The center provided after-school programs, adult education classes, job training opportunities, and small business incubation services, creating a model that other communities could replicate and adapt to their specific needs. Standing beside me at the ceremony was Dr. Sarah Washington, the center's director and a former principal from Chicago who had revolutionized 3 different urban schools before agreeing to lead this ambitious project. Sarah embodied the kind of visionary leadership that the trust sought to support, bringing both practical experience and innovative thinking to the challenge of creating educational opportunities that could break cycles of poverty and limited opportunity. Her presence at the ceremony represented one of many successful partnerships the trust had developed with educators and community leaders who shared Margaret's commitment to creating lasting positive change. The crowd gathered for the ribbon cutting included many faces that had become familiar to me over the past 5 years, as I learned to navigate the complex world of philanthropic leadership and community development. There was Maria Gonzalez, a single mother who had completed her GED through the trust's adult education programs and was now pursuing a nursing degree with scholarship support. Standing near her was James Carter, a teenager who had discovered his passion for engineering through the Trust's STEM mentorship program, and had just been accepted to MIT with a full scholarship that would allow him to pursue his dreams without the crushing debt burden that had defined my own educational journey. The success stories represented by the people at this ceremony validated Margaret's decision to invest in character over blood relationship, demonstrating that wealth used wisely could create ripple effects that extended far beyond any individual beneficiary. The trust had funded similar centers in 6 other cities, supported teacher training programs in rural districts, and provided scholarship assistance to over 3,000 students who were the first in their families to attend college. Each investment had been carefully evaluated and monitored to ensure that funding was creating sustainable improvement rather than temporary relief. My role as the trust's primary steward had evolved dramatically from those early months when I felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of Margaret's gift and the complexity of managing such substantial resources. Through partnerships with experienced foundation leaders and extensive education in nonprofit management, I had developed skills in strategic planning, impact measurement, and collaborative leadership that allowed me to honor Margaret's vision while adapting her principles to changing circumstances and emerging opportunities. The lonely teacher who had once struggled to afford classroom supplies had become someone capable of designing and implementing multi-million-dollar initiatives that created lasting change in communities across the country. The Sterling family members had followed very different trajectories during these same 5 years, learning painful lessons about the consequences of entitlement and the reality of life without inherited wealth as a safety net. Robert Sterling had struggled most dramatically with this transition, finding that his management experience at Sterling Properties had limited value in the job market when separated from family connections and guaranteed resources. His attempts to secure executive positions at other real estate companies had been largely unsuccessful, partly because potential employers questioned his actual competence versus his family advantage, and partly because his entitled attitude and resistance to accountability had created interpersonal problems in every workplace he attempted to join. The Affordable Housing Foundation that now operated Sterling Properties had declined to retain Robert's services after an initial transition period, revealed his fundamental incompatibility with their mission of serving working-class communities rather than maximizing profits for wealthy investors. His suggestions for increasing revenue consistently involved raising rents, reducing maintenance expenses, and finding legal loopholes to avoid tenant protection requirements, approaches that directly contradicted the Foundation's commitment to providing stable, affordable housing for essential workers and low-income families. Robert's financial situation had deteriorated steadily as he struggled to maintain his previous lifestyle without the income and resources he had expected to inherit from Margaret's estate. The Greenwich mansion where he and Patricia had lived rent-free for decades was now operating as the Margaret Sterling Museum of American Real Estate Development, forcing them to purchase a much smaller home in a less prestigious neighborhood, using savings and investment income that wouldn't last indefinitely without substantial employment income to supplement their resources. Patricia's social standing had suffered even more dramatically than Robert's financial situation, as news of the will's contents and Margaret's detailed documentation of their character flaws had circulated throughout their elite social circles. The charity organizations where Patricia had held prominent board positions had quietly distanced themselves from her involvement, uncomfortable with the negative publicity and concerned about potential damage to their reputation. Her carefully cultivated image as a philanthropic leader had been permanently tarnished by revelations about her discriminatory attitudes and superficial approach to charitable giving. The couple's marriage had also experienced significant strain as they struggled to adjust their expectations and lifestyle to match their reduced circumstances. Arguments about spending, social obligations, and employment decisions had become increasingly frequent and bitter, revealing fundamental incompatibilities that had been masked by financial security and social status. Patricia blamed Robert for failing to anticipate Margaret's intentions and protect their inheritance prospects, while Robert resented Patricia's continued emphasis on maintaining appearances they could no longer afford. Brandon Sterling's adjustment to life without inherited wealth had been complicated by his complete lack of practical work experience and his unrealistic expectations about employment opportunities available to someone with his educational background, but limited actual skill. His MBA from Wharton had provided networking opportunities and theoretical knowledge, but his years at Sterling Properties had involved mostly ceremonial responsibilities that hadn't prepared him for the performance-based evaluation and accountability required in competitive job markets. His initial attempts to find executive positions had failed when potential employers recognized his sense of entitlement and lack of genuine experience with challenging projects or difficult decisions. Brandon's resume looked impressive on paper, but interviews consistently revealed his inability to provide specific examples of accomplishments or demonstrate practical knowledge of real estate development, financial analysis, or team management. His assumption that family connections and elite education would automatically translate into career success had proven completely wrong in a world where employers expected measurable results rather than prestigious credentials. The luxury lifestyle Brandon had maintained through family resources had become unsustainable once he was forced to rely on entry-level employment income and the modest savings he had accumulated during his years of effectively guaranteed financial security. His expensive Manhattan apartment had been replaced by a shared living situation in Queens, and his collection of luxury vehicles had been sold to cover living expenses while he searched for stable employment that matched his skills and experience level. The psychological adjustment had been perhaps more difficult than the financial changes, as Brandon struggled to accept that his previous comfortable position had been based on family wealth rather than personal merit or achievement. His social circle had gradually distanced themselves from him as his financial circumstances declined and he was no longer able to participate in expensive entertainment and social activities that had defined his identity for most of his adult life. Sophia Sterling's experience during these 5 years had involved a particularly dramatic fall from the lifestyle influencer status she had built around displaying wealth and luxury experience. Her social media following had gradually declined as her content shifted from exotic travel and designer purchases to more modest lifestyle choices necessitated by her reduced financial circumstance. The audience that had been attracted to her displays of privilege and consumption had little interest in following someone whose life more closely resembled their own economic reality. Her attempts to monetize her remaining social media presence through brand partnerships and sponsored content had been largely unsuccessful, partly because her follower engagement had declined significantly, and partly because her previous content had established her as someone whose lifestyle was funded by family wealth rather than personal earning power. Companies seeking authentic influencers to promote their products were uninterested in partnering with someone whose credibility had been undermined by revelations about her character and values. Sophia's search for employment outside social media had been complicated by her lack of traditional work experience and her difficulty adjusting to workplace environments that required cooperation, accountability, and respect for colleagues regardless of their social status. Several retail and hospitality positions had ended unsuccessfully when supervisors and coworkers complained about her attitude toward customers and her resistance to following standard procedures and protocol. The most significant challenge for Sophia had been developing genuine relationships and social connections that weren't based on financial advantages or social status. Her previous friendships had been largely transactional, built around shared luxury experiences and mutual social media promotion rather than genuine compatibility or emotional support. As her financial circumstances changed, these superficial connections had evaporated, leaving her isolated and struggling to understand how to build meaningful relationships based on shared interests and mutual respect. The extended Sterling family members had experienced similar patterns of adjustment and decline, though some had adapted more successfully than others depending on their individual circumstances and character traits. David Sterling's investment banking career had provided him with more transferable skills and professional connections than his brother Robert possessed, allowing him to maintain employment and financial stability even without the expected inheritance supplement to his income. However, David's relationship with his twin sons Michael and Matthew had deteriorated significantly when he was forced to reduce their financial support and inform them that the expensive graduate school educations he had promised were no longer affordable through family resources. Both young men had struggled to accept this change in their circumstances, having grown up with expectations of unlimited educational and lifestyle opportunities funded by family wealth. Michael had eventually adjusted to these new realities by pursuing a more affordable educational path and taking responsibility for financing his own future through student loans and part-time employment. This experience had actually benefited his character development and work ethic, providing him with practical skills and genuine appreciation for educational opportunities that he had previously taken for granted. Matthew had responded less positively to these changed circumstances, becoming increasingly bitter and resentful about what he considered his family's failure to provide the advantages he had been promised. His inability to accept responsibility for his own future and his continued sense of entitlement had created ongoing conflict with his parents and limited his success in both educational and employment settings. Helen Sterling Morrison's legal career had provided her with the professional skills and income stability to weather the loss of expected inheritance income. But her reputation within the legal community had suffered from her unsuccessful attempts to challenge Margaret's will and her association with the Sterling family's public humiliation. Several high-profile clients had chosen to work with other attorneys, rather than risk negative publicity from association with someone whose family disputes had become public knowledge. Her daughter Caroline had perhaps benefited most among the extended family members from the loss of expected inherited wealth, as the necessity of building her own career and financial independence had motivated her to develop genuine legal expertise and professional relationships based on merit rather than family connection. Caroline's law practice had grown steadily as she proved her competence and reliability to clients who valued her skills rather than her social status. The contrast between the Sterling family's decline and the positive transformation occurring in communities served by the Margaret Sterling Educational Trust had become increasingly apparent over these 5 years. While Margaret's relatives struggled to adjust to reduced circumstances and accept responsibility for their own lives, the Trust's investments were creating opportunities for thousands of people to achieve educational goals and economic mobility that had previously seemed impossible. The Trust's scholarship programs had supported students from low-income families in pursuing college degrees that led to career opportunities in fields ranging from healthcare and education to engineering and social work. Many of these scholarship recipients were now contributing to their communities as teachers, nurses, social workers, and small business owners, creating positive economic and social impacts that extended far beyond their individual achievement. The teacher training programs funded by the Trust had improved educational quality in dozens of school districts, particularly in rural and urban areas that had historically struggled to attract and retain qualified educators. These initiatives provided both financial support for teachers pursuing advanced degrees and professional development opportunities that enhanced their effectiveness in serving students from challenging backgrounds. The community development centers modeled after the East Harlem facility had become catalysts for neighborhood revitalization in cities across the country, providing not only educational services but also small business support, healthcare access, and social services coordination that addressed multiple factors contributing to poverty and limited opportunity. These centers had created thousands of jobs while simultaneously improving educational outcomes and economic mobility for residents of underserved communities. My personal life had also been transformed by the responsibilities and opportunities that came with managing the Margaret Sterling Educational Trust. The isolation and financial stress that had characterized my early teaching years had been replaced by meaningful work, financial security, and relationships with people who shared my commitment to using resources for positive social impact. I had married Dr. Marcus Thompson, a pediatrician who worked in community health centers and shared my values about service and social responsibility. Our wedding had been a modest ceremony focused on celebration with friends and colleagues, rather than a display of wealth or social status, reflecting values that Margaret would have appreciated and approved. Marcus brought his own commitment to serving underserved communities and his understanding of how systemic problems required comprehensive solutions rather than individual charity or temporary assistance. Together, we had purchased a comfortable but not ostentatious home in a diverse neighborhood where we could be part of a genuine community rather than isolated by wealth or social status. Our lifestyle reflected the financial security provided by the trust while maintaining connection to the values and experiences that had shaped both of our characters before we gained access to substantial resources. The trust's work had also connected me with a network of philanthropists, educators, and community leaders who had become both professional colleagues and personal friends. These relationships provided intellectual stimulation, emotional support, and collaborative opportunities that enriched both my work and personal life in ways that money alone could never have accomplished. Looking back on the dramatic changes of the past 5 years, I often reflected on Margaret's wisdom in structuring her estate to reward character over bloodline and long-term impact over short-term benefit. Her relatives had assumed that wealth automatically belonged to family members regardless of their personal qualities or contributions to society. But Margaret understood that true legacy comes from using resources to create positive change that extends far beyond any individual lifetime. The Sterling family's shock and anger at losing their expected inheritance had revealed the depth of their entitlement and their fundamental misunderstanding of what wealth means and how it should be used. Their assumption that blood relationship automatically entitled them to inherited financial security had been replaced by the harsh reality that money, like any other resource, should be earned through character and contribution rather than simply inherited through genetic lottery. Margaret's decision to bypass traditional inheritance patterns had created a model for wealth transfer that prioritized social impact over family privilege, demonstrating that inherited resources could be used to expand opportunity rather than perpetuate inequality. The Trust's success in creating educational and economic opportunities for thousands of people vindicated her belief that character-based succession could achieve better outcomes than automatic blood-based inheritance. The educational programs and community development initiatives funded by Margaret's wealth continued generating positive impacts that would extend for generations beyond her lifetime, creating opportunities for countless individuals to achieve their potential and contribute to society in meaningful ways. The ripple effects of these investments would continue expanding long after the Sterling family members who had felt entitled to inherit her wealth had been forgotten by history. Standing at the podium during the community center's dedication ceremony, I addressed the crowd of families, students, educators, and community leaders who represented the true beneficiaries of Margaret's vision and value. I spoke about her belief that education could transform lives and communities, her commitment to creating opportunities for people who had been overlooked or underestimated, and her understanding that wealth carries obligations to serve purposes larger than personal comfort or family advantage. The applause that followed my remarks came from people whose lives had been directly improved by Margaret's posthumous generosity and her decision to trust someone she had observed demonstrating character and integrity over many years. Their appreciation validated the choice she had made to invest in values-based leadership rather than blood-based inheritance, proving that her radical approach to estate planning had created lasting positive change that would benefit countless future generations. As I cut the ribbon and watched children rush into their new community center, I felt Margaret's presence and approval in ways that transcended any material inheritance or financial legacy. Her true gift had not been money but the opportunity to use resources for creating positive change, the responsibility to honor her values through careful stewardship, and the privilege of continuing her work in building a more just and equitable society. The Sterling family's loss of their expected inheritance had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their character and contributions, while Margaret's trust had enabled me to discover capabilities and purposes I had never imagined possible. The dramatic reversal of our relative positions had demonstrated that true wealth comes from using whatever resources we have to serve others and create positive change, regardless of the size of our bank accounts or the prestige of our family name. Margaret's legacy would continue expanding through the educational opportunities, community development initiatives, and systemic changes funded by her wealth. But her most important contribution had been demonstrating that inheritance should be based on character rather than bloodline, and that money should serve purposes larger than individual comfort or family privilege. Her decision to reward values over genetics had created a model for wealth transfer that prioritized social impact over personal advantage, showing that inherited resources could be used to expand opportunity rather than perpetuate it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.